So a warm welcome, a bit about me. So I am a qualified coach with Animas, qualified a few years ago. I'm also a wellbeing consultant and a public speaker on mental health, and also a therapist in training. So you can see a lot of what I do is very focused around mental health and wellbeing. My background is in occupational psychology, and I've got nearly 20 years experience in learning and organisational development across various sectors, going from the charity to sort of FMCG to professional services. So I myself have been on a personal journey with mental illness where I got a diagnosis of complex PTSD, which I'll come to talk on a bit later. So now I'm very much focused on raising awareness around mental health to really break the stigma and open the conversation for those who might be struggling. And I know for many people, it feels like there's a pandemic going out there in terms of mental health. And as much as we can do, it's all going to make a difference. I'm also a trustee for a mental health charity, and I'm also a poet, which came about during my recovery journey, when I'll talk about a bit later on. So why did I become a coach? So for me, from very young age, especially given I'm working in learning development, I enjoy helping people, and that, I suppose, goes into my own value base, where it's very much about helping, supporting people who might be on a journey or struggling. So a lot of the coaching that I did was within the workplace, so supporting people in career development, or as part of development programs. And the reason why I'm now trained to be a therapist is so that I can take things on a deeper level. So with coaching, that has its place, but with therapy, it's all about going a bit deeper and working in a different way. So for me, that's the way forward. So what I'll be covering today is about trauma. So today is all about trauma, and I'll be talking about it from my own personal experience and my own lens, my own learnings and insights that I've developed along the way, and also a bit around what you might want to consider and think about if you're working with clients who do have trauma. And it's about raising a bit of a level of awareness about trauma. So you're not going to leave here being qualified professionals in trauma, but it's all about giving you an insight. And today is really about not me sitting here as a professional either. It's sitting here as someone who's had a human experience of trauma and sharing that learning. So I will be talking about some difficult topics, such as suicide, and these can feel difficult. So if you are feeling triggered, please do take time out, take care of yourself. As mentioned, it is being recorded, so you can always come back to it. So self-care is paramount. So yeah, so let's get started. So what is trauma? So this is one definition, is that trauma is an emotional or physical response to one or more physically harmful or life-threatening events or circumstances, which does have an adverse impact on mental and physical well-being. So that kind of positions it. But what does that actually look like? So it's a normal response, and it's a human response, and what's something I've learned along the way is a lot of the time it's a normal response to an abnormal situation. A lot of the time we can kind of feel like, oh, this doesn't feel right, but it's it's expected response. You have things around what we call big T, which is big trauma, and little trauma. So big trauma is sort of defined by sort of life-threatening situations or events. So that could be things like war, natural disasters, violent crimes, serious car accident, or even death of a parent. So it's quite disturbing, and there is a threat to life. What would be classified as little t, is an ongoing situation that might cause distress or fear, and even a sense of helplessness. So it could be relationship problems, it could be loss of a job or financial worries. And while the incidents are not actually a threat to life, they could have a similar impact on a person as something as big T. but the symptoms you would typically find are normally less severe. Relational trauma. So this could be an after effect of abuse, neglect, or suffering, especially for children who develop the kind of relational trauma based on their interactions as a child, and later on struggle in those relationships as adults. So trauma is unpredictable and the response is not guaranteed. You don't know, how you might respond or how someone else might respond. And it's different responses from person to person. Everyone's built differently and has different levels of resilience. And it can be a life or death situation, as mentioned, but it can also be perceived or actual. So it's all down to your own perception. If you feel like you are in a threatening situation, that's how it can be impacting yourself. And it can be the result of witnessing events. So it's not just something happening to you. It could be something that you've witnessed or even heard about, something happening to a loved one. Now, trauma can happen in a lot of scenarios. So it could be in relation to a death. It could be experiencing things like infertility, ill health, racism, job loss, or poverty. So all these things can create a trauma response within an individual. Now I'm just going to touch on trauma-informed coaching. So when you're thinking about working with trauma in a coaching situation, it would be more so around understanding the trauma and the impact on your client in the present moment, and how you can support them in overcoming barriers and to reach their goals and achieve the growth that they want. And it would be, if the trauma is unresolved, unprocessed, and still really having a big impact on the individual, then that would be where therapy comes in. So counselling, psychotherapy, that's the place to actually work through the trauma. And you wouldn't really do that within coaching because of the complexities and needing the kind of professional background to work with that. So with trauma, you can also develop PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. So what is it? So it used to be called shell shock, and it used to be really linked to kind of war veterans. For those coming back from war who are experiencing PTSD, obviously these things have evolved and there's a lot more understanding and knowledge around when PTSD can develop. And it's unprocessed trauma. So when you're experiencing an event, what typically happens is it's almost like the file doesn't get filed within your brain, and it stays active, it stays alive. And so you'll still have experience symptoms, things like flashbacks and reliving. And it's once that trauma has been processed, then it can start to be kind of the impact of it can be decreased, which I'll talk about a bit later. It's a longer term response to a traumatic event. So there's no, guidelines on when this can develop. It can happen within a few weeks, months, or even much later. But not everyone who experiences trauma will develop PTSD. As I mentioned, everyone's different, wired differently. And the help and the support that's received immediately after an event can impact the development of PTSD and also the severity of symptoms. So that's things like getting professional help, having family or friends supporting you through there, so you don't feel isolated, and you have that support. And recovery from trauma is common, and I'll talk about this in a bit more detail later. So you do have medical definitions around PTSD. So in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's quite a mouthful, it's defined as when a person experiences or witnesses a traumatic event that is where there's actual or threatened death, serious injury, or sexual violence. And there are symptoms over 5 categories that you'd be looking for, and that the symptoms persist longer than 1 month. And complex PTSD, so within the International Classification of Diseases, it's the diagnosis is the same as PTSD plus 3 further sets of symptoms across additional categories, which I'll come on to in a moment. So a bit around the symptoms. What can it look like? Now, reliving. So this is where you're reliving the event, and it can be reliving it as though it's happening in the here and now. And that can be in the form of flashbacks. And flashbacks is not only just in your mind kind of remembering something, it can be physical. So you're actually having the same physical responses you had when you were in that moment. Your senses can get reactivated. So you have the same sort of smells, the same sounds. So it really is like you're literally back in that moment. And you have things around nightmares. So again, that's reliving it in different formats. Hallucinations and triggers and reminders can all make you kind of relive it. And what that can do, it reactivates your whole body to be back into that place where you would typically go into fight or flight. Again, I'll talk a bit more about that later. Avoidance might start to occur where you're avoiding people, places, thoughts, situations that remind you of what happened. And that can lead to feelings of detachment and isolation, and you can, end up avoiding going to places where you can engage in hobbies or do things that you previously enjoyed. So it really can have an impact on yourself. So increased arousal, this is where you might have an overload or excessive emotions. So it could be, and that could lead to problems relating with others, showing affection, difficulty in sleeping, irritability. You might have outbursts of anger, which you wouldn't have before, affected your concentration, and become easily startled. So really, it's around your emotions almost becoming heightened, as well as your physical responses. Negative cognitions and mood. So this is developing negative thoughts and feelings. So that could look like feelings of blame, feeling estranged, and feeling disconnected, and also not feeling hopeful about the future. So that could also be something that develops. Suicidal thoughts can also feature within PTSD. So this is also quite common and sometimes more common in severe cases, but it is again part of the illness and part of the diagnosis. And again, with help and support, can be moved through. Cognitive interruptions, so that could be things like memory impairment, lack of ability to focus, brain fog. So it really does have an impact on your brain activity as well, and your sort of what you were previously comfortable and competent in doing. Things might change and might feel difficult doing day-to-day tasks, doing your job, doing simple tasks around the house. So that can really become interrupted. And general stress, so depression, low mood, anxiety, so those can all feature as well. And with complex PTSD, so in addition to some of these symptoms, it could be around problems of regulating emotions. So again, that could be feelings emotionally numb, feeling anger, not feeling anger, maybe having a reaction to something which is perhaps exaggerated to what you would expect. Negative beliefs about self, that could be around feeling shame, guilt, feeling like a failure, feeling like you're hopeless, you're not going to really overcome things or achieve anything in life. And also difficulties developing and sustaining relationships. So you might feel detached from people that you didn't feel detached before, struggling to express what you're thinking or feeling, and that can have a knock-on impact for relationships. Now, the impact of trauma on the brain, that could also be quite significant. And the image on the screen just basically shows the three main areas which are impacted. That's the amygdala. So that's what you call almost your alarm system in your brain. And what a traumatic event can do, it can activate it. But then what happens is, because of the changes in your brain's actions, it doesn't stop when it's meant to. So your brain constantly thinks that you're in danger and it will be activated. So it's almost like your emotional and an instinctual center. So it doesn't kind of deactivate itself when it needs to. And the hippocampus, so it controls things like memory. So what it might do is not be able to differentiate that this event happened in the past and you're now in a different time and you're safe. So the hippocampus isn't able to regulate that. So with consistent exposure to trauma, it can shrink. And then there's the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for regulating emotions and impulses. And with PTSD, it does reduce its ability to do that. So you might have, as I mentioned previously, some of the reactions and emotions you experience are not what you probably had before you got diagnosed with PTSD or experienced a traumatic event. And in terms of in terms of healing, it can be really useful to engage what you'd call the prefrontal cortex and the whole body in healing. And things like yoga, meditation, music, art, dance, and some other therapies that I'll talk about later, that can really have an impact when working with trauma. And I just want to show you this brain scan where you can see on the left-hand side, the brain scan of someone with PTSD, you can see a lot more activity where you see the sort of yellowy green, and you can compare to someone who doesn't have PTSD. So you can see it does actually have an impact on the whole brain side. And then for someone experiencing trauma from a young age, it can actually affect your brain development and the way your brain develops. So that's also something to take into consideration. So in terms of the responses to a traumatic event, they can be quite complicated and what someone experiences from one to the other. And most of you probably heard of fight or flight, but within a trauma response, you could have 4 potential responses. So it's flight, where you literally take yourself away and you might run or you might just go away. Fight is where you actually take on the situation where you don't have an option of fleeing. So you take on, whether that be a conversation, a physical fight. And freeze is where you literally go into shutdown. And it's almost like it's a way to become invisible almost. You might lose your ability to talk, to think, and you'll literally just become frozen. And then fawn, which is where it's almost like you're trying to befriend or take on what the sort of danger. You might try to diffuse a situation just to kind of move it forward. And what would typically happen? Someone might have, when they experience a traumatic event and they go into one of these responses, that might be a response that becomes a pattern if they are met with another traumatic event. So that becomes almost their learned behavior, how they respond to a traumatic event. And when they're sort of reactivated or triggered, that is the kind of response that you might expect. And how might this look in terms of behavior? Someone who goes into fight mode, they might see a lot more aggression, a lot more anger, and quite high energy, almost kind of in the animal world, taking it on, the stance, the body language, the movement. In terms of flight, so it might be a higher sense of anxiety, panic, and avoidance, especially where they can't face it and they kind of take themselves out. So they might typically end up avoidant of any situation they perceive to be a threat. Freeze, so shut down. So someone who goes into that sort of reaction, you might typically see them being a bit more dissociated with themselves, with other people, difficulty accessing emotion, and that might be complete numbness. And someone in the fawn, so this is quite interesting, especially when you're working with clients in a coaching sort of scenario, is behaviors like people pleasing, or codependency, or lack of boundaries that can develop. Especially where you're kind of crossing over into someone else's sort of area where it feels uncomfortable, you might typically want to might develop behaviors to keep yourself safe, and that feels like a safe way to be. So those are some of the sort of a bit of the science behind trauma, and what it actually is in terms of definitions, in looking at it from the sort of the medical lens, and how people might respond in those scenarios, and then how they'll be impacted in terms of symptoms. Now, along my journey, which I'll come on to in a few moments, there has been a lot of learnings, and someone who has really resonated with me, and created a lot of learnings and insights and light bulb moments for me, has been a guy called Gabor Mate. So my slides are not moving. One moment. Here we go. So this is Gabor, and who is he? He's a physician by background, and also an established author of many books. So his background was in family practice, and he had a special interest in trauma and addiction, and looking at the impacts of trauma on physical and mental health. And what is really interesting is that his association with trauma and chronic illness. And for me, when I was going through my journey, I was hearing more around, trauma, living in the body, and how it manifests, and then how it might kind of come out in terms of illnesses. So it could be anything from autoimmune disease, ADHD, cancer. And what was really interesting, his approach to addiction focuses on trauma, and it looks at what his patients have experienced. And what he also goes into is things around sort of child development. When children are experiencing trauma, how that manifests, and how that affects things like their brains, their behaviors, their perception of the world. And something that really hit me was about him saying trauma is what happens inside you and not what happened to you. And for me, that made a lot of sense, because you're met with a situation, and how you react internally is how you will kind of have that imprint within you, and how that then manifests, and how it comes out in terms of physical symptoms, and also how your behavior changes. So in terms of impacts on trauma, he talked a lot about when you experience a trauma, it can lead to you a separation or a disconnect from yourself and other people. And how that can look is that it's losing trust. So it almost becomes a way of kind of protecting yourself from that kind of harm. And it's the disconnection could be due to how you interpret things and how your emotions develop. And it can create a distorted perception of the world, so where you feel innately unsafe. And so, what before felt safe and you didn't think twice about, you might be thinking more around, and adapt your behaviour accordingly. And, there's a lot of people, there's a desire to escape the pain or the wound. And a lot of the time it is people experiencing trauma, they're not necessarily aware of the pain or the wound, and how they can overcome that. As we talked about, talked about brain development, how that can be impacted, especially with children. And the thing is, children cannot self-regulate their emotions. So the way it would manifest is very different to an adult. And when as a child experiencing trauma, then becoming an adult, they will still struggle with self-regulation. So that's emotions and reactions. Shame of self, a lot of the time where symptoms are quite bad and quite persistent, there's no relief, there can be a lot of shame, and that comes alongside sort of mental health as well. A lot of people will experience shame of not being able to move forward, not being able to function. And that can really then have massive impact and compound the outcome. And it's all about being stuck in the past. So you might have moved on from the event, but you really feel like you're still in that moment, and the way you react in the present is actually a reaction to the past. And again, if you're thinking about it from working with clients, it's thinking about, what are they sharing, what's happening for them in the present, and what does that link back to. So you have behaviors that develop, emotional reactions and triggers. So sometimes it could be about delving into and understanding, okay, where has this come from, and how do you move forward. Some really powerful quotes, and for me, a lot of these, they hit quite deep, and that's why I'm sharing them today. And it really kind of made me think more broadly, and I think when you experience trauma, especially for me at the start of my journey, I was very sort of within my own head. I didn't understand, and it took me a while through education, so psychoeducation, to understand this is what's happening to me and this is why. So yeah, just to share a few. So one that I think just really is powerful is that the attempt to escape from pain is what creates more pain. And a lot of the time where, in a lot of scenarios, people can't face the pain. And sometimes that is what leads to things like addiction or unhelpful behaviors, destructive behaviors. So in trying to escape it, and as difficult as it is to face the trauma, that is where the work typically needs to happen. Much of what we call personality is not a fixed set of traits, only coping mechanisms a person acquired in childhood. So that goes back to childhood trauma. So what might seem like, a personality trait, it could actually be a coping mechanism which was developed as a response to trauma. And something I've been reflecting on recently is whenever I do the personality test, I come out as an introverted. And I did think, was I born an extrovert? And did things that happen over life sort of change who I am, change who I became? So that's just something to think about as well. And this is another one that I love. The question is not why the addiction, but why the pain. And that goes back to the first point in what sits behind it. So again, if in a coaching situation, you have a client with an addiction, what is sitting behind there? What is led the individual to develop these behaviors, to develop this addiction? What is the pain that needs to be worked through that sits behind it? And understanding that can, even for the individual, can make a big difference. And lastly, the core belief in having to be strong is a defense. So a lot of the time, and I had it myself, kind of took it on as being independent. I need to be strong in order to get through. And one way not to feel rejected is never to ask for help or never to admit weakness. And again, that's all around self-protection, and to believe that I am strong enough to withstand all. And a lot of the time, especially when it's been childhood trauma, you become sort of, you can build resilience and the belief systems that you need to be strong. You need to have almost sometimes a bravado that to avoid putting yourself in danger or being vulnerable. So these are some of the things that can develop. So there are other people in the field of trauma who talk a lot about it, who've done research, and I'll mention one a bit later on, but there is a lot out there. And I think for me, it's been what has resonated is what I've carried through and brought through to my session today. And it's thinking about how could these things show up in show up in coaching. And some of these things that are showing up could be clues to perhaps there's a trauma that sits behind it. And might give you a bit of clue in terms of what might need to be explored. And I think as coaches, it's us sitting back and being able to reflect what we're seeing, and being authentic in term, and being open and honest, and using our intuition. I think really using our intuition to kind of gauge what's going on in that space, be it virtually or in a room. So I've given you a bit of a whistle-stop tour in terms of trauma and a bit of background. What I'm going to talk about is now my own experiences, my own journey. And again, yeah, I'll be talking about some typical topics. So if you do need to take some time out, then please do. So what I've done is kind of brought together some of my key experiences that have, from childhood. Up until the age of 11, quite a lot happened. So when I talk about sort of trauma from childhood, there was quite a lot. So at the age of 11 months, I had an accident with sort of a big hot pot of tea, and that resulted in quite bad burns. I was in hospital for 6 weeks. Obviously, this is not something I recall, but if you're thinking about how it manifests in the body, there would have been trauma there, and I was away from my family for 6 weeks, so that would have had an impact. And then at the age of 7, I had a car accident where I was hit by a car, and again, I was lucky that I didn't have an injury, but just from experiencing that sort of near death at the age of 7, it feel like experience it, that would have kind of really had an impact. And I had a father who had an addiction with alcohol, and living in a household with that, it does create trauma. And it was, not knowing if, and he ended up in hospital a few times from having an accident, and it had an impact and financially. So there was sort of that financial trauma as well. And there were lots of elements and experiences that happened during that time, which now stay with me. If the raising of voices reactivates every response in me. So it does have a long-lasting effect. And he lost his life when I was aged 11, and that was an accident due to alcohol. And for me, what happened, I went into the freeze mode. So I pretty much, I don't remember really experiencing emotion, experiencing grief. And I pretty much just focused myself on education. And for me, that was a way to get through. And it was only until the age of 16 that I what I call my thawing stage, where I started to experience grief, and the emotions are quite intense, and I experienced a lot of low mood and depression. And I went into starting university age 18, and the low mood continued. And when I reflect back on my childhood and going on, sort of thinking about my recovery journey and what I learned, as a child, I actually developed suicidal ideation. So that almost became my escape route, and a way to cope with the pain. And it's something that stayed with me into adulthood. And a lot of children do find coping mechanisms, and I was very much withdrawn. I was virtually mute. I didn't speak. I didn't share my thoughts, my feelings. I was quite isolated. I really struggled with friendships at school, and I had lots of issues, and long periods of time where I didn't have any friends. So I was quite isolated around the school. I was prone to bullying. It's typical that the quiet person becomes a target. I spent a lot of time in my own thoughts, and yeah, I was quite studious, but I spent a lot of time in my own thoughts, and kind of just faded into the background. Age 19, I was at university, had a near-death experience. Still to this day, don't know what happened. I ended up in hospital, and I'd gone out with friends, and not drunk a lot, but ended up in hospital after I kind of collapsed and hit my head. And that was a real, I suppose, traumatic event, where I was experiencing things like flashbacks and being triggered, and it was it was distressing, and it was something that has stayed with me. But I think it's definitely something that I've managed to work through. And age 23, that another sort of traumatic experience. So I lived with my grandparents for most of my life, and within a few months they passed from long-term illnesses, and kind of experiencing that and witnessing that was extremely difficult. And then within 3 months, my mum was diagnosed with cancer. I was quite young, and for me, after losing my father, that was my biggest fear. Anything happening to my mother. She was integral part of my life, and she had a massive impact, and that was something that was difficult and to work through, and it was very traumatic in just even getting that news. And then kind of 5 years later, she lost her battle with cancer, and that was a huge loss in my life and in the family. And I kind of took time out. I made sure that I grieved. I connected my emotion. But what I've really learned is that grief doesn't ever leave; it stays with you. And your life kind of evolves and grows around it. So it's kind of always been there. And kind of later on into adult life, had other experiences. So I was diagnosed with endometriosis back in 2015, and in the space of a few years, I had 5 operations, and in between that, 3 rounds of IVF due to infertility, and of which one resulted in ectopic pregnancy. And I think it's again, now reflecting back, getting the diagnosis of endometriosis was traumatic, and I kind of just got on with things, and took it in my stride, and again going for the rounds of IVF. But I think the ectopic pregnancy, which was the second round, was the real turning point. And even in the 3rd round of IVF, for those who are familiar, towards the end, before I was due to test whether it being success, I collapsed in the middle of the night, and again that just was re-traumatizing. And what happened from then was a lot of difficulties. So then a few years later, back in 2017, where I started what I'd call my rapid decline. So I was very tearful. I was having panic attacks in the middle of the night, and I think the first time it happened, I thought I was having a heart attack, and I was laying in bed for about half an hour, and my heart was going really fast. I couldn't control it, and eventually kind of calmed down. And after the ectopic pregnancy, a lady that I knew who kind of worked in the kind of health fertility field said to me, "Anita, I think you've got PTSD." And to me, I didn't make the connection. It was like something that, people come back from war experience. So, and what is this about? So I didn't really put the two together. So I continued, and I was wearing a mask every day. And it was becoming difficult to wear that mask. The outside world saw me as someone who's functioning. I was going to work. I was going to, events, seeing family, friends. But it was very difficult. And I, since the age of 18, I've had counselling on and off, but it wasn't actually helping at all. It wasn't kind of doing what it has done in the past. And I was really, really struggling. And kind of what I know now is that my bucket was overfilling. So it was almost like all the traumas that I'd experienced in life, and on that timeline was some of them. There were others that have happened along the way, that my bucket had overfilled, and I couldn't actually take on anymore. My whole body was reacting. My mind was not able to kind of adapt or control. I developed suicidal ideation. So that means that, I didn't want to be here anymore. I didn't want to live. I didn't want to take up space. I felt, because of the infertility, and again, that caused a lot of trauma, not just from going through treatment, but just from the fact that I couldn't conceive and had to go for treatment. I experienced a lot of trauma, and that was it. The ectopic was the sort of the last thing that kind of really tipped me over the edge. And instinctively, I knew I needed more. I mean, I was in counselling, reflexology, acupuncture, homeopathy, everything I could, which was geared towards the fertility side, but it also wasn't helping me mentally. And I had two thoughts. I need to go on a yoga retreat. Started looking into it, quickly realised that it's actually not what I need. I need more, because I was really struggling. Things were getting worse, which is when I contacted a hospital. So for those who are familiar with the Priory, it's a chain of private psychiatric hospitals in the UK. And I was very fortunate that I was able to access it through private healthcare. And it was a real experience. I kept questioning myself and doubting myself that is this actually what I need? Even going to see the psychiatrist there, who was going to admit me. And then within a week I was there, and what happened quite quickly is I entered and I deteriorated. It was almost like I'd left the world, gone into a safe place. I kind of started to unpack all the baggage, and my symptoms actually got a lot worse. And for anyone going through therapy, you typically become more unwell before you start to see a difference. And a lot of people don't recognize that, but it's about you've gone from functioning day to day, keeping things held together, and then you start to unpack it, and everything comes flooding out. So in terms of my symptoms, before I went in there, I was experiencing depression, low mood, anxiety, and panic attacks. And ongoing, as I mentioned, it got a lot worse. And I remember in the first few weeks, my heart would be constantly going, and I couldn't stop it. And it was just in a constant state of flux and distress, and I couldn't regulate. The regulation got worse, so I couldn't control my emotions and my physiological responses. So within sort of being admitted, I was, after 3 weeks, I came out and started as a day patient. And by then I had been engaging in things like group psychotherapy, art therapy, drama therapy, and one-to-one. And it was really the psychotherapy side which really started to get to the root causes. And then within a few weeks, that is when the flashback started. So I then started to develop other symptoms, which are all linked to sort of PTSD symptoms, which I touched on earlier. So flashbacks, I was reliving events as though I was back in that moment, and they would be real physical responses to memories, or talking about memories, and they were quite difficult, and I'd become very unsettled. Hypervigilance, that's where you feel you're in a constant state of feeling unsafe. You're kind of on high alert. That's how I would describe it. And there was a point where I didn't even feel safe at home. I was on the verge of barricading myself in my bedroom. That's how bad it got, and I couldn't explain it. And it was intense. And sort of hallucinations I experienced, where I had hallucinations of my mother being in the room, hallucinations of me as a child walking around a room, and again, that was a lot of, I think, the processing where things like this can happen. Regression, that's when the times are actually almost went back to a childlike state, and certain things would happen where in terms of my behavior, my thinking, and then dissociation. So this is sort of almost like a mental process where a person will disconnect from their thoughts, feelings, their self, their sense of identity. So how that looked for me was I'd almost be physically in a room, but mentally I was not there. And it's the way I can describe it is a lot of the time, and I've realised it's happened to me a lot over life, is I'd be in a setting with other people and it's almost like my head's in the clouds. And it's almost like I detach myself, and I think it's something I did as a child as self-protection, to take myself out of a traumatic situation, and that is quite common and dissociated, and people can develop dissociative disorders that where it can be a lot more intense, where they'll go through moments where they're actually completely out of their body. You won't be able to engage with them, they can't interact with you, so it can be quite extreme. I did have an occurrence of, when I'd go into a flashback, I would then become dissociated, or if I was triggered, I could become dissociated, and a lot of the times it would be difficult for me to even speak, and I did have moments where I completely dissociated. My ability to speak would completely shut down and shut off. So again, those were difficult moments. And with the sort of flashbacks, there was an experience where I went into a flashback, which was sort of 20 years prior, and I was stuck in that era. And it took a few hours for me to come out and back into the present. And again, this is, the reason why I'm kind of sharing how it looks when it's kind of at the kind of more difficult end is that working through trauma, it really requires a skilled professional to kind of work through these kind of things that are happening and things that are coming up, and can be really difficult. And I think even for my loved ones, it was difficult to see and witness kind of all these things happening. And it was, through learnings that, what helps in those moments, and which I'll talk about a bit later. But just kind of staying on the symptoms of regression, what I'm showing on screen is there was a moment within one of the group activities where I was doing some we had worksheets and we'd work through things, and the part highlighted here is where my writing actually switched to childlike. You can see on the other parts of the page, my writing is pretty much joined up and in a different format. But what happened was my brain almost switched, and I became back to my child self, and that came through in my writing. And that is something that can happen. And a lot of the time, therapists would say, if you write with your left hand, that's kind of connecting with your child self, and things can come through. So this is just, I suppose, a live example what regression can look like, and that can happen in different ways. So in terms of the treatments that I've experienced, so mentioned I had group therapy, group psychotherapy, that was really powerful. And the image on the left is actually a picture from drama therapy, where it was a different way of talking about, this is from about transactional analysis. So it was, and for me, drama therapy and other therapies was a great way for me to kind of get things out, because I struggled to connect with my emotion, especially anger, struggled to say what I was thinking and feeling. So things like art and drama really helped me. EMDR, so some of you might be familiar with this. So it's really about helping to process trauma. So it's a structured therapy that really helps on processing the memory. So I mentioned earlier about when a traumatic event happens, it's almost like it doesn't get filed. This helps it to process and actually to file and where it needs to be, and so to stop the intensity of being triggered and reaction. So it kind of almost helps put it to bed a bit. And my experience is, so it's experiencing bilateral stimulation. So it could be eye movement. So when you're kind of talking about an event, the therapist would kind of use this and your eyes would follow, and that would help to process it. If you've not heard of it before, it sounds a bit out there, but it actually works. There's a lot of research, and it helps people with trauma and PTSD symptoms, as well as things like anxiety. Medication. So I was always a bit reluctant, but when I started developing a lot more severe symptoms, it really helped me, and I took it for a period of time. And what it did, and what I always said, I don't want to not be able to access my thoughts or feelings, and work with a psychiatrist to make sure that I had the right dosage so that didn't happen. I did a lot of work with the body. So as kind of talked about before, the trauma does live in the body, and what you can't access here, you can access through the body. So the therapists are very trained and skilled in working in this way with somatic therapy. So, and in coaching, I think I remember learning it on Animas, it's where are you feeling things? And it's almost, I would hone in on that feeling, where I'm feeling it, and then I would actually start to get information through my body in that way. It was very powerful, and for me, it worked really well. And just the combination of these different therapies, I think, really helped me in my recovery journey. Sand tray therapy, and that was part of sort of art therapy. So what that really helped, and I think it'd be great to use in coaching, is almost using different figures to look at different dynamics in relationships, and what you want to see and what change you want to see. So it can be really powerful in that way. And this is an image that I drew kind of in the art therapy. And I've got 2 folders of art, and a lot of it is quite dark, especially from the beginning. And it was a way of expression, and for me to kind of get my thoughts and feelings out. So these are just some of treatments, but there are other treatments out there that can really support with trauma. And I think it's about knowing what, if someone going through trauma, knowing what works for you, and all these things can really help to process the trauma and work through it. So for me, some pivotal learnings, exploring my core beliefs. So what are my core beliefs that I suppose have been born out of trauma and trauma responses? And again, this is something that's really useful to do in coaching, is to think about what are your core beliefs and where have they come from, and really, is it serving you well in today? And if not, kind of what work can be done around that to unpick it and to, I suppose, relearn what are some of your core beliefs. So, for example, things around, I must serve others before serve myself. That was something that had developed, and it was been a lot of unlearning and unpicking that has helped me to understand it and recognize when I'm actually doing that. Transactional analysis, absolutely love the work around that, and it's a powerful tool for understanding human relationships, but also how you communicate with yourself. And it looks at how we speak and respond to others and the role that we play. And the thing that really stood out for me when I first learned about this was the 3 ego states. So you have what we call the parent, adult, and child. So it's not your actual parents, it's almost, it mimics the significant relationships that you have. So for example, if you had quite a critical parent, your inner voice could be quite a critical parent, and so that's something you've learned over time. And again, being able to identify that, it can help to unpick some of those unhelpful thoughts and feelings that impact you in the here and now. Grounding techniques that helped me a lot, especially when I was experiencing flashbacks, dissociation, being triggered, and I'll come on to some in a moment, but it really brings you back in the present. So when you are being triggered or reacting, it's kind of taking you back and to your past trauma. So this can really help move you through. The mind and body connection. So I've talked about this previously. So understanding that, what you think happened, what does happen here can also happen in your body. And there's the mind-body connection. And then also you've got the mind-gut connection that can also have a big impact. So where am I now? I still experience hypervigilance, but not to the level which I had previously. And that is around, I can't really do well in closed spaces, or typically if I go to a restaurant, I will sit with my back to the wall. I feel safer that way. Safety is important. If I don't feel safe somewhere, I won't feel settled, and that can be just my perception or feeling or a sense that I get. I can be guarded and selective about who I kind of let in. I can get triggered, so I typically know what things that I wouldn't talk about, which I know might trigger me. So again, it's big about being self-aware. But I am more self-aware. I know myself a lot more over this journey, understand myself a lot more. And I've learned to prioritize myself, which I didn't used to do. So I do the things that I enjoy. I've kind of got to know myself in that way. I share my learnings, and this is obviously today's one of them. And I really tap into my intuition, and that is what I leverage quite a lot on a day-to-day and use it in my decision-making, sense of people. And what I've really got is a lot of tools in my toolbox for life, I call. And it's through my own journey, it's a lot of things that I've learned I try to share with others because they've been really useful. You may not control all the events that happen to you, but you can decide not to be reduced by them. A beautiful quote from Maya Angelou. And I think it is very much sometimes a choice. You can choose to take a different path. And a lot of the times people who come to coaching, they want to take a different path. And I think it's very much about taking that empowerment and taking forward. What I've learned about trauma. So there's a book called The Body Keeps the Score, which some of you might be familiar with, by someone called Bessel van der Kolk. So he's another, I suppose, godfather within trauma, PTSD. And this is quite a comprehensive book where it really delves into experience of trauma, how the body continues to relive it and how it shapes your mind and your body. So it might be good reading if you're interested. It's based on a lot of research and real life examples. It's common. A lot of people might not even know that they're experiencing it, but it's there. And it goes back to what I said earlier. It could be the big T or the little t. Trauma isn't the event, but how you actually respond to it. And a lot of that I've learned through Gabor. The impact of the event can be mitigated if you have the right support mechanisms in place straight after. Good relationships equals the foundation of healthy responses. So it's almost good relationships over time will go into that bank of, enable you to have a healthy response. Previous experience and elements of your personality can impact the influence of the trauma. So that, it would be different from person to person. Changes your brain, as I mentioned before. And something that I really experienced was a struggle to feel pleasure or joy. And ever since sort of coming through my recovery journey, that is something that I can access now. And I think it's through the processing and everything which has really allowed me to do that. There's no quick fix. When I first went into the hospital, I kept asking how long till I feel better, and it was no defined period. And I was told it will take as long as it needs to take, and it's a journey, and it was. You do find a lot of adaptive behaviours, and which will might come through in coaching. So things like people pleasing, being a perfectionist, self-abandonment. So it's not always going to be the case that it's born out of trauma, but it may very well be, and it could be something that you want to explore in that session. How it manifests in the body, does it lead to chronic illness? And again, not everyone who experiences trauma will get a chronic illness, but again, where the trauma lives in the body, is it something that manifests and leads to that? Engaging with my inner child. So yeah, a lot of work went into doing that, because I was never connected, and that is, I think, goes back to the first point, which allows me to feel kind of joy and happiness. And healing is not linear, and you might hear about this a lot, and it's not linear. There is a lot of ups and downs, and it's a journey, and there'll be, sometimes it will be big curves and smaller curves. So when you're thinking about working with clients, just going back to what I said at the start around trauma informed, and it's really making sure you're working within the realms of your capabilities as a coach, if you're a coach. And so it's things around contracting that will really create the safety, and making sure that you as a coach and your client understand what would be happening in the sessions, and making sure that there's agreement on what you do and don't kind of work towards, and how you work together. Boundaries for not just for the client but yourself, and making sure that you know where the coaching ends and where something else might need to come into play. And where you might need to signpost, is there other professional help that's needed, and at which point would you then flag that, to make sure that the individual is being held and supported in the right way. And is therapy needed? A lot of the time as coaches, you might encounter individuals who are looking for something, and in the same way, when I was thinking about, do I go on a yoga retreat, but it's signposting them to actually what you're describing is might be more sort of better in a therapeutic relationship. And sometimes if someone has experienced trauma, their survival strategies mean that they might not be open to change. So again, it's maybe looking into that and seeing where that's coming from, and is there anything that needs to be worked through that could support them. How are you showing up? So again, thinking about your coaching methodology. So are you mirroring what you're seeing? And what is your body language saying? A lot of the time your body language might be leaking something, and giving the wrong kind of message to the client, which then might cause them to react and kind of retract and go into themselves. So really thinking about you're mirroring their body language, but also what is their body language telling you. Grounding techniques. So this is if you are working with clients who've experienced trauma, if they are feeling themselves kind of developing a physiological response, grounding techniques will really help. So one that really helped me is working with your senses. So if they are kind of getting triggered, trying to bring them back into the moment, you can ask them, 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can touch, 3 things that you can hear, things that you can smell, and things that you can taste. And obviously you're kind of working your way down. And that can be really helpful. And every time it brought me back into the present. And another thing to use is a breathing technique. So one is the box breathing, where you're breathing in for 4 seconds and letting the breath out for 4 seconds. And what that again does is allow the person to focus on their breathing and to bring their whole body system down and their nervous system. Another thing that was really quite useful is butterfly tapping, where you're just pretty much just tapping, and that can help. It's almost self-soothing, and it can be really helpful if a client's feeling overwhelmed. When we work with clients, obviously it's important to have the right core conditions. So that is things like building trust in the relationship, being non-judgmental, so they do feel comfortable opening up, showing empathy, that's very important. So you can put yourself in their shoes, as opposed to showing sympathy, where that can cause a difference in kind of power dynamics. Being accepting, and also being genuine. You can always sense when someone's not being genuine, so having a genuine interest in them and their well-being and their story is going to be important. All the things that I've spoken about today, which you might be seeing in a coaching session, can help you recognize whether there is trauma at play. But again, if they're showing extreme symptoms, then it might be that you need to signpost or refer them to someone professional who can work with them. Because when I was at my worst, there was no way I could engage in coaching, and I needed that professional help. Suicidal risk and suicidal ideation. So this is it's a difficult one, and a lot that people struggle to kind of handle. But I'd say talking openly about suicide is one of the most effective ways to affect prevention. And what it does, it takes away the stigma where they can talk about it. You can ask them, I'm getting a sense that you might be feeling suicidal, things that they're saying, like, they're feeling hopeless, they have no reason to live, just looking out for those signs and clues. And having a conversation. And a lot of time people have the thoughts that if you talk about suicide, you give them ideas. No, you don't. It's actually a way to prevent it. So be open and have, ask the question if you really get in that sense, and it can save a life. Hypervigilance or flashbacks, if that does happen in a session, even though I've worked through a lot of it, am I coachable? Yes. Can I still get a flashback? Yes, probably likely. And I think it goes back to using the grounding techniques just to get the person back in the here and now and make sure that they're well, and keep them kind of in a safe space. And again, I think it goes back to boundaries, understanding what might re-traumatize a client, and not kind of going over into that space, and what is a window of tolerance, and working tentatively and slowly with them, and for them to guide you in terms of what isn't working. Holding space, and again, it goes back to the core conditions. You need to make sure they feel safe, heard, seen, and that they can use the space as and how they need it. Feeling safe, again, it goes back to building that trust, building those relationships so that they feel safe enough to kind of share if they need to. Emotions, there'll be a range of emotions that come through, and that's normal. And there's a range where you might be deemed negative, but all emotions are valid. So allowing that space for the emotions. And what I'm sharing is Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So, if a person is not feeling safe, they don't have their basic needs met, then it's going to be difficult to get to the self-actualization, which you might want to see in coaching. So I think it's just keeping that in mind, that it's getting those basic things first. So that could be go back to building relationships and to build on that going forward in their relationship. And just considerations for yourself as a coach when working with clients. So recognizing when you're perhaps going into rescue mode, and being an enabler. So really recognizing in yourself when that's coming through, and kind of going back from it, allowing people to take responsibility for their actions, and not trying to solve their problems, and not going into fixing and resolutions. You don't want to give the message that the person needs fixing, so you don't want to kind of start throwing out or getting them to get to solution mode. Sometimes they need to stay in a space where they are kind of exploring things. Supervision, as coaches, that's going to be a critical point, to make sure you're engaging in supervision, especially if you're working with individuals who are bringing through different kind of challenges for you. How do you manage client disclosures? Again, making sure that you hold the space, remain calm, non-judgmental, and accepting of whatever they are choosing to share, because it's going to create a safe space for them, and that's going to be important. Relinquish control on the process. So you might, in your mind, you might have a thought around, okay, this is what we're going to do, but being able to let that go and working with the client at their pace and what it is that they need. Attunement and presence. So what is going on in the moment? So are you able to sense what's going on, what changes are going on, and just making sure you remain present, even if you might feel, you know, you're having a reaction. I think it's making sure that you tune back into your client to make sure you stay with them. And have you done the work? So if you are getting triggered by your own traumas or things that are happening, and it can show up when, if you've been on a journey of discovery yourself and you've worked on yourself, you're able to kind of connect with that person. So again, it's being able to recognize when you know things are coming up for you that might need to be worked on, and doing what you need to do to work through it, because again, as a coach, you don't want to be triggered in those scenarios. So that concludes the sort of, from my perspective, some things that are helpful if you are encountering trauma with a client. But as I mentioned, it's not about trying to process the trauma, and if they need professional help, it's signposting and making sure that they have kind of that professional help. So before I finish and move to questions, I mentioned at the start that through my journey, I did start to write poetry, and I have a lot of poetry, but I wanted to finish by sharing a poem with you. And it's entitled "It's Not Me." And so this was from 2018, when I was kind of in the depths of my illness. It's not me, it's my illness, you see. It takes me to a place where I stand alone in the woods. It's dark and gloomy with dead leaves. I don't see a way out of the woods. I try to break through by smashing trees, but they stand so strong and overpowering me. It's the roots deeply embedded, not allowing such a change. It's too ingrained. I stand exhausted after 8 months of trying. I've shed buckets of tears so I can keep fighting. The pain and hopelessness keeps reigniting. It's my despair as I look at my life. All I wanted to do was be a mother and a wife. My life tells a sad story, barely any moments of glory. Yet I keep looking for a way out before my tears cause a drought. The journey continues with no known destination. I need to find it fast before I end up cremated. So I just wanted to share one of the poems with you, and we'll move into questions. But if you want to find me, you can find me on LinkedIn, which is, I've got a QR code, and Instagram, and also my website and my email.